When people think of World War II, the date that almost always comes to mind is September 1st, 1939, the day German tanks rolled into Poland, triggering Britain and France to declare war on Hitler's Reich. But what if that date was merely the eruption of a war that had actually begun 2 decades earlier? What if the true beginning of World War II was not 1939, but 1919, the year the Treaty of Versailles was signed? To understand this provocative idea, we need to go back to the end of the First World War, a conflict that contemporaries believed would be the war to end all wars. Instead, the flawed peace settlement of 1919 created the exact conditions that allowed fascism, militarism, and a second global war to flourish. The illusion of peace. In November 1918, when Germany agreed to an armistice, many in Europe believed peace had finally arrived. The Kaiser had abdicated, the German army had retreated, and the Allies prepared to dictate terms. But peace was not negotiated, it was imposed. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was presented to Germany as a dictated peace diktat. German representatives were excluded from the negotiations, forced to accept terms that dismantled their empire, stripped away territory, and placed the blame for the entire war squarely on Germany's shoulders. For Germany, this was not peace, it was humiliation. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, at the heart of Versailles was the infamous Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause. It declared that Germany bore full responsibility for causing World War I, and therefore had to pay reparations. This clause wasn't just a legal statement, it was a psychological weapon. It branded Germany as morally guilty, a nation of aggressors, and justified the crushing reparations that followed. To ordinary Germans, this was intolerable. Even those who hated the Kaiser's militarism rejected the idea that an entire nation, including millions who had simply fought and suffered, could be blamed for the war. The sense of injustice would fester for years, becoming a rallying cry for extremists. Reparations and economic collapse. If reparations imposed on Germany totaled an astronomical 132 billion gold marks, about $33 billion at the time, this figure was beyond what Germany could realistically pay, especially after losing key industrial territories like Alsace-Lorraine and the Saar Basin. The result: economic catastrophe. In 1923, when Germany fell behind on payments, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr industrial region. German workers went on strike, and the government printed money to support them. The result was hyperinflation so severe that workers were paid twice a day because money lost value within hours. Families carried wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread. Life savings vanished overnight. For the German people, Versailles was not only a humiliation but also a source of daily suffering. It bred resentment that would later be weaponized by demagogues. Political chaos and extremism. German Empire collapsed in 1918, replaced by the fragile Weimar Republic. But this new democracy was born under a curse. Many Germans associated it with defeat, humiliation, and Versailles. Right-wing nationalists spread the myth of the stab in the back legend, claiming that Germany had not lost the war militarily but had been betrayed by Jews, communists, and weak politicians at home. On the left, communists attempted uprisings, inspired by the Russian Revolution. On the right, paramilitary groups known as the Freikorps roamed the streets, violently suppressing leftists while dreaming of restoring German pride. This toxic mix of anger, poverty, and political instability created fertile ground for radical ideologies. A seedbed for Hitler. Adolf Hitler himself was a product of this environment, a failed artist and a decorated veteran of the First World War. He was radicalized by the chaos of post-war Germany, the humiliation of Versailles, the collapse of the economy, and the bitterness of the stab in the back. Myth gave him the themes that would define his political message. In his speeches, Hitler repeatedly hammered the injustice of Versailles. He vowed to tear up the treaty. He promised to restore German honor. He blamed Jews, communists, and foreign powers for Germany's suffering. Without Versailles, Hitler might have remained a fringe figure. With Versailles, he became the voice of a nation desperate for revenge. The failure of Wilson's dream. It's important to remember that not everyone envisioned Versailles as a punishment. U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had proposed his famous 14 points, calling for self-determination, open diplomacy, and the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. But the realities of European politics intervened. France, devastated by 4 years of trench warfare, wanted security and revenge. Britain sought to maintain its empire and naval dominance. Italy demanded territorial gains. Wilson's vision was largely ignored. The League of Nations was created, but without U.S. participation since Congress refused to join. It was weak from the start. Instead of a balanced peace, Versailles became a powder keg. 1919, the real beginning. Looking back, it becomes clear why some historians argue that the Second World War didn't begin in 1939 at all. The war was already embedded in the DNA of the Treaty of Versailles. The humiliation of Article 231 ensured a desire for revenge. The crushing reparations destroyed the German economy. The political chaos gave rise to extremists like Hitler. The weak League of Nations meant there was no real system to enforce peace. In short, Versailles planted the seeds, and 1939 was simply the moment they bloomed into catastrophe. The ink was barely dry on the Treaty of Versailles when the cracks in the post-war order began to appear. The Allies had promised peace, but what they had really created was a fragile structure propped up by resentment, fear, and wishful thinking. Between 1919 and 1939, Europe staggered through two turbulent decades defined by economic collapse, failed diplomacy, and the rise of leaders who promised to overturn Versailles at any cost. If World War II was the explosion, then the interwar years were the slow fuse, burning steadily toward disaster. The economic domino effect. German economy had been dealt a crippling blow by reparations, but the problem wasn't confined to Germany. The global economy was interconnected, and the punishment imposed on Germany reverberated outward. To pay reparations, Germany relied on loans from the United States, funneled through the Dawes Plan of 1924 and later the Young Plan of 1929. The money flowed in a circle. American banks lent to Germany. Germany paid reparations to Britain and France, and those allies used the money to pay back their own war debts to the US. This system was fragile, and when the Wall Street crash of 1929 hit, the entire arrangement collapsed. American banks called in loans, Germany defaulted, and unemployment skyrocketed. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 Germans was out of work. Desperation swept the nation, and extremist parties capitalized on the misery. The rise of dictators. While Germany spiraled into economic and political crisis, other nations faced their own turmoil. Across Europe, democracies struggled to deliver stability, and where democracy failed, strong men rose. In Italy, Benito Mussolini seized power in 1922, presenting himself as the savior of a nation humiliated by Versailles. Italy had been on the winning side of World War I but felt cheated, denied territories it had been promised. Mussolini exploited this sense of betrayal, rallying crowds with promises of restoring Roman glory. His success provided a model for other dictators. B. In Japan, resentment over racial discrimination. At Versailles, the Allies had rejected a Japanese proposal for racial equality fueled nationalist sentiment. Economic woes and military ambitions combined, leading Japan to invade Manchuria in 1931, openly defying the League of Nations. And in Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party transformed from a fringe movement into a mass political force. In the 1928 election, the Nazis won just 2.6% of the vote. By 1932, amid mass unemployment and despair, they were the largest party in the area. Versailles had promised stability. Instead, it created the conditions for authoritarianism to thrive. The weakness of the League of Nations and of the boldest promises of 1919 was the creation of the League of Nations, designed to prevent future wars through collective security. In theory, it was a revolutionary idea. If one nation acted aggressively, all others would unite to stop it. But the League was crippled from the start. The United States, ironically, never joined. The U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, leaving the League without its most powerful backer. Decisions required unanimous approval, making decisive action nearly impossible. The League's failures quickly became evident when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. The League condemned the act but did nothing. Japan simply quit the organization. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions, but they were weak and ineffective. Britain and France, unwilling to alienate Mussolini, allowed the conquest to continue. When Germany reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, a direct violation of Versailles, the League again failed to act. Each failure emboldened aggressors. Nations learned that international law was meaningless without enforcement. The myth of appeasement. If Versailles sowed bitterness, then your warriors were defined by hesitation and appeasement. Britain and France, haunted by the carnage of World War I, were reluctant to confront aggression. When Hitler began defying the treaty, he carefully tested the waters. In 1935, he openly announced rearmament, building an air force and expanding the army beyond Versailles limits. Britain and France protested, but did nothing. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone established by Versailles. Hitler later admitted that if France had resisted, he would have retreated, but France stayed passive, fearful of sparking another war. By the time of the Munich Agreement in 1938, appeasement had become official policy. Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, handed over the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Hitler, believing he had secured peace for a time. In reality, he had simply fed Hitler's ambitions. The failure of democracy in Germany's Weimar Republic was supposed to represent a new, democratic Germany, but it was hamstrung from birth. Its constitution created a system where proportional representation fractured the parliament, making strong governments rare. The trauma of Versailles also undermined the republic's legitimacy. Many Germans never forgave the democratic leaders who had signed the treaty. To nationalists, the Weimar politicians were November criminals. By 1930, as the economic depression deepened, extremist parties surged while moderate coalitions collapsed. Street battles between communists and Nazi paramilitaries became common. Democracy appeared weak, chaotic, and incapable of solving Germany's problems. When Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933, it was not through a coup but through a system that had been hollowed out by 2 decades of crisis. Versailles echoes beyond Germany. It's tempting to focus solely on Germany, but the consequences of Versailles rippled globally. Eastern Europe was carved into new states like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, based on Wilson's promise of self-determination. But the new borders left ethnic minorities stranded across nations, creating simmering conflicts that dictators later exploited. The Middle East was reshaped as the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British and French carved territories into mandates, ignoring local populations. This laid the groundwork for future instability that lasts to this day. Colonial soldiers, who had fought for the Allies, returned home to find promises of equality unfulfilled. In India, Egypt, and elsewhere, resentment grew, fueling anti-colonial movements. Versailles was not only the seed of World War II, it was the beginning of a century of geopolitical tension. The inevitable collision be the late 1930s, the stage was set. Versailles had created a Germany humiliated yet determined to rise again. The global depression had fueled dictatorships across Europe and Asia. The League of Nations had revealed itself as powerless. Every attempt to preserve peace, whether through appeasement, diplomacy, or economic concessions, merely delayed the inevitable. The world was not moving away from war but circling closer to it. When Hitler demanded Poland in 1939, it was not the beginning of his aggression. It was simply the moment when decades of resentment, failure, and miscalculation finally erupted. By the time the world had stumbled into the 1930s, the unresolved crises left festering since 1919 were ready to ignite again. To many contemporaries who lived through the years between the wars, the Treaty of Versailles had not really closed the chapter of the Great War. It had simply set the stage for a sequel. That is why so many modern historians argue that World War II did not really begin with the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939. But rather with the flawed peace settlement 2 decades earlier. The Versailles framework had created a Europe that looked stable on maps but was riddled with cracks beneath the surface. Germany itself was the most obvious fault line. After years of humiliation, hyperinflation, and occupation of its industrial Ruhr region, the Weimar Republic survived largely by balancing on an economic tightrope. supported by American loans through the Dawes and Young plans, but the 1929 stock market crash in New York sent shockwaves across the globe. Credit evaporated, unemployment soared, and German politics descended into chaos. The streets became battlefields between communists and nationalists, with ordinary citizens increasingly drawn to extremist solutions. The resentment seeded by Versailles bloomed into a poisonous political culture that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party exploited masterfully. They did not invent German anger, they harvested it. Yet the chain reaction went beyond Germany. Across Eastern Europe, new nations born in 1919 struggled to define themselves. Poland had returned to the map after more than a century of partition, but its borders were unstable, contested with nearly every neighbor. Czechoslovakia was hailed as a democratic success. Yet it contained large ethnic minorities, particularly Germans in the Sudetenland, who felt alienated from Prague's government. Hungary, stripped of two-thirds of its territory by the Treaty of Trianon, seethed with a national trauma nearly as deep as Germany's. These resentments festered in silence until the 1930s, when revisionist powers began to challenge the fragile post-war order openly. Italy also felt cheated. Though it had fought alongside the Allies and was promised territorial rewards, the Italians called their settlement a mutilated victory. This sense of betrayal fueled Benito Mussolini's rise in 1922 and pushed Italy into an aggressive foreign policy, invading Ethiopia in 1935 and aligning itself with Hitler soon after. Once again, Versailles had not resolved conflict. It had merely redirected it. The League of Nations, created as the crowning achievement of Woodrow Wilson's vision, proved powerless to restrain any of these aggressors. Without American participation, the U.S. Senate had refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty. The League lacked teeth. It condemned Japanese expansion in Manchuria, but Tokyo ignored it. It censured Italy for its war in Africa, but Mussolini shrugged. When Hitler began openly defying Versailles, rearming Germany, remilitarizing the Rhineland, annexing Austria, the League and the Western powers hesitated, fearful of another bloodbath like 1914 to 1918. Each failure emboldened the revisionist states further. One of the most overlooked elements of the 1919 settlement was the economic angle. By tying Germany to reparations payments and depriving it of key resources, the Allies thought they were guaranteeing stability. Instead, they ensured fragility. The German economy's dependence on foreign loans made it particularly vulnerable to global downturns, while resentment over reparations never fully faded even after they were reduced. This economic squeeze, combined with nationalist humiliation, created a combustible mixture, one that Hitler turned into political fire. It is also worth noting that not everyone in 1919 saw Versailles as the end. Figures like French Marshal Ferdinand Foch warned that the treaty was merely an armistice for 20 years. His words proved eerily prophetic. 20 years and a few months later, war broke out again. To Foch and others, the contradictions were obvious. Germany was both crushed and left strong enough to rise again. The Allies were both triumphant and terrified. The peace was both celebrated and condemned. Versailles had papered over the wounds, but left the infection untreated. By the late 1930s, the world was merely watching Versailles unravel. Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 was less the beginning of something new than the final snap of a thread that had been fraying since 1919. It was the culmination of 2 decades of grievances, economic shocks, and political failures. To many in Eastern Europe, the Second World War had effectively begun years earlier, as border disputes, paramilitary clashes, and civil wars raged across the continent. The Spanish Civil War 1936 to 1939 became a rehearsal ground for German and Italian weapons, tactics, and ideology. Itself a byproduct of the instability Versailles had failed to resolve, even outside Europe. The global consequences of Versailles were clear. In Asia, Japan, excluded from racial equality clauses and denied many of its territorial demands, felt slighted by the Western powers. This humiliation became a factor in its militaristic expansion, eventually leading to the Pacific Front of World War II. In the Middle East, orders drawn by European diplomats created tensions that persist even to this day. The peace of 1919 was not truly peace, it was a rearrangement of conflict. So, was World War II truly a separate war, or merely the continuation of World War I under a new name. Many historians lean toward the latter. The years between 1919 and 1939 were not a calm interlude but an extended countdown, with each crisis economic, political, diplomatic bringing the world closer to renewed catastrophe. When German troops crossed into Poland, they did not start a brand new conflict. They reopened one that had been smoldering for 20 years. In hindsight, the idea that 1919 was the real start of World War II is not just a provocative theory. It forces us to look at history differently, to see wars not as isolated events, but as chapters in a longer narrative. The First World War and the Second are bound together by cause and effect, wound and scar. One cannot understand the latter without seeing it as the unfinished business of the former. That, perhaps, is the most haunting legacy of Versailles. It was meant to guarantee the war to end all wars. Instead, it guaranteed that another war larger, bloodier, and more devastating would come. The men who signed the treaty in 1919 believed they were closing the door. In reality, they had left it wide open. And so, if we are to answer the question, when did World War II truly begin? The honest reply might not be September 1, 1939, but June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The ink on that treaty was the true spark, and everything afterward was simply the slow burn to global catastrophe.